I have a long printout of all the questions that people wanted to ask in the last session. So I'm confident we'll be able to feed some of those in. Yeah. So I think we can be able to use those as we continue this session as well. Okay, thank you so much, Emily, and welcome back, everyone. This is just a great way to continue our conversation. This is Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Day 1, Session 2, AI Regulation, Governance, and Equity. I'm Ted Wittenstein at International Security Studies in the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. We really look forward to building on the session from this morning featuring Professors Feigenbaum and Vishnoi. In case you missed it and are just tuning in, that video will be made available for the viewership of everyone. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Anat Hathaway, and our forum director in just a moment. And of course, we'll introduce our distinguished panelists, Anat, Lior, Nathaniel, Raymond, and Wendell, Wallach. I think we're getting accustomed now to this technical setup for those in the room, raising your hand and pressing the green microphone. And of course, if you're viewing this virtually, submit the written question using the Q&A button on the right of your screen. So this is a great collaboration, as you know, between the Jackson Institute and Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. It's hard for me to believe that Ona and I are now in our 5th year of this program. The topics change, but a lot of the themes remain constant, even as challenges in cybersecurity continue to get more complex. And the AI-focused discussion of these 3 sessions really draws that out. We're looking, as you know, at 3 areas where AI already is posing a number of cybersecurity challenges, whether it's big data and data privacy and AI governance today, disinformation and the future of democracy on March 4th, and AI ethics and safety on April 1st. So please do tune in through all those sessions. Professor Hathaway, of course, is our forum director, and the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith, Professor of International Law, Director of the Center for Global Legal Challenges at Yale Law School, faculty member at the Jackson Institute. She's joined by Anat Lior, who's a resident fellow at Yale Law School's Information Security Project. Her research focuses on the intersection of artificial intelligence, tort law, insurance law, and antitrust law. She obtained her doctorate from Yale Law School. She was a teaching fellow once for me and a few other professors in this room. Her law degree from the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya in Israel. And she also worked with Professor Aaron Barak, former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, focusing on comparative constitutional law. Nathaniel Raymond is a colleague of mine at the Jackson Institute, a lecturer in global affairs, as well as a lecturer in epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health. He teaches graduate courses ranging from data governance to humanitarian disaster response. If you don't think those are related, I think you'll see how that's not true. I mean, his research interests really do focus on human rights and the security implications of information communication technologies, such as this recent cyber attack against the Red Cross, which I suspect we might discuss this morning. And we're very pleased and delighted to be joined by Wendell Wallach, a fellow with the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, an important program aimed to understand worse. And he's also a senior advisor to the Hastings Center and a consultant, ethicist, and scholar at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where he previously served as chair of the Technology and Ethics Research Group. Wendell is an internationally recognized expert on ethical governance concerns posed by emerging technologies, particularly AI and neuroscience. And indeed, he's made many foundational contributions to the field of AI ethics, to include 2 influential books, Moral Machines, Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, where he introduced the concept of artificial moral agency, AMA, for those who were part of our intelligence conversation with Joan and Nishith earlier. I think this will be a great way to continue that aspect of our session, as well as Dangerous Master, how to keep technology from slipping beyond our control. So thank you so much, Wendell, for joining us. Nathaniel, Anat, for being with us this morning. I'm going to turn it back to Ona now to kick off the session. And remember to submit your questions online. And of course, we'll get to you in the audience as well. So thank you very much. And over to you, Ona.
Great. Thank you so much, Ted. It's, as I said, the last session, really a pleasure to be in the room with all of you today and to get a chance to continue the conversation from this morning and continue to build our understanding of these areas with everyone in the room and everyone online. So we're going to run this session the way we did the last session, which is I will pose some questions to our panelists and have a bit of back and forth with them. And then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, both in person and online. I'm going to try to keep my own questions to a little bit more of a minimum this time because we both have 3 panelists and we had a lot of questions we weren't able to get to last time, although we have them printed out and we'll try to get to some of them this time around. So let me start with you, Nathaniel. So in addition to your teaching at the Jackson Institute and the Yale School of Public Health, you've also been working with the Red Cross and you have a background in working in humanitarian projects. And Red Cross was a recent victim of a sophisticated cyber attack. Apparently more than 500,000 people receiving services from the Red Cross. Their information was compromised in this attack. So what can you tell us about this cyber attack? And just more generally, what does this latest incident highlight about privacy risks associated with large data sets like the kinds that are retained by the ICRC and other humanitarian NGOs? Is this the type of target that we might see as becoming more vulnerable? I mean, in the past, we haven't seen humanitarian organizations necessarily be targets of attacks. Is this a sign of something we should worry might be kind of the sign of the future?
So the most surprising thing about the ICRC hack is not that it happened, it's that we know about it. And what occurred is on November 8th, 2021, likely through a unpatched hole in a server for what was called restoring family links, a attacker entered consistent with what's called APT 27, Advanced Persistent Threat Actor 27, which is consistent with a Chinese state-like modality of attack. And I want to very specifically say that doesn't mean that it was China. It means it was an attack pathway that's consistent with China state-related past activities. Though the email that was sent to the Red Cross suggesting that an actor had the data was from an actor consistent with Iran. So at this point, we have no idea who it is. On November 8th, the actor entered the server with bespoke code and looked like a legitimate actor, accessing about 517,000, as Ona said, files from a very specific database. And this database is called Restoring Family Links, which has information about people looking for missing persons and information about missing persons and POWs themselves. The data was likely from about 60 countries, and we have to assume the data was taken. The breach was discovered by ICRC January 18th and then disclosed 4 days later. And as I said at the beginning, what is surprising is that we know. At Jackson Institute, my colleagues and I wrote with the United Nations the first critical incident guidance for what we call data critical incidents, such as this, where humanitarian data has been breached, intercepted, or handled negligently. And in this case, the ICRC performed flawlessly in terms of notifying and disclosing. In a way, this is going to sound weird. What happened with the Red Cross hack is a good news story of organizational response functioning exactly how it was supposed to. The bad news here is that this really is not a technological story as much as it is a story of an absence of norms. And while the State Department spokesman Ned Price called for accountability, in the case of the Red Cross hack, there has been no unified international statement of condemnation that humanitarian data is equal to a humanitarian facility, a humanitarian vehicle. And the view of those of us who work with the Red Cross in what we call data responsibility and data protection is that this incident is the same as if a hospital was attacked in a bombing, or if an ambulance through what's called perfidy was used to deceptively to conduct an attack. And so really this is on one hand a good news story about ICRC's response, but on the other hand it highlights in big yellow highlighter the gaping hole in international doctrine about, simply put, humanitarian cyberspace. The last thing I'll say, and this is, I don't think it's news, but it hasn't been discussed, is there's a backstory here to this specific hack. In 2019, at the quadrennial review of the Geneva Conventions in Geneva, I was there and I spoke with Estonia about the need for commentary on the Geneva Conventions about humanitarian data. Behind the scenes, what was happening is there was a negotiation of a resolution by the states parties specifically about the Restoring Family Links database. And at the last minute, we had a statement that was ready to go that was going to say humanitarian data must only be used for humanitarian purposes. At the last moment, the United States changed it to states must endeavor. And there were other states parties who I will not name who were pushing for that language to be watered down. And that was specific to this data and this database. Over.
Yeah, that raises a lot of really troubling questions. And I think just to highlight for students in person and online, the more general question of how do we think about data in international humanitarian law is a whole host, and in jus ad bellum. So is a data, for instance, a civilian object? Is data being held by humanitarian organizations, part of the protected by the traditional protections that apply to humanitarian organizations? I think is really a set of open, really important questions that we're seeing emerge, and where there's relatively kind of unclear rules about these issues. And I think the kind of challenges that Nathaniel brought out are important to actually filling these gaps and getting states to agree on applying these traditional rules to data, and particularly to humanitarian data. I wanted to connect up next to the implications of the rise of AI in conflict situations. So there's a way in which the situation you just described could potentially have some implications in conflict situations, but what are some other ways in which we might worry about AI and conflict? Might AI and development of these kind of techniques allow more sophisticated attacks? What kinds of implications that might this have, both for state-to-state conflict and non-state actor to state actor conflict?
There's the big. Oh, gotta press the button. Technology. So the headline here is that artificial intelligence runs on not a new type of data, but a type of data that we don't really have norms for to the degree that we do for PII, personally identifiable information. It runs on DII, demographically identifiable information. And humanitarians and intelligence services alike produce large amounts of DII to both target services, to target attacks, on a data level of generating information about populations for decision support. And that means that when AI is used in conflict settings, regardless of the actor, it is increasingly about predictive analytic, or basically, in the case of ICRC, targeting DII repositories for exploitation, often tactically. And so it means that there's two ways that AI shows up in this quest for what I call dominance in not cyberspace, but the social digital terrain. That AI is at the intersection of three: informatic patterns and basically informatic metadata, data about data. And so I don't even like the word cyberspace. I find it say like sort of shag rugs, bell bottoms, the 1970s. It's anachronistic when what we're really talking about is that the battle space has migrated to this social digital terrain. And the currency in that social digital terrain is DII dominance on situational awareness and busting the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, getting ahead of the OODA of the other or defeating the other's OODA. And so AI is the primary main battle tank in this story. One, it can be accurate. The other, it can be extremely inaccurate. And so I'm worried more about negligence than omniscience. And for those of us on the humanitarian side, most of the harm we do with AI is inaccuracy around trying to build these demographic data sets for decision support, which is its own moral and technical hazard.
Let me ask you just one more question, and then I want to move on so that we make sure we leave time for questions at the end. But this session is particularly focusing on questions of governance and equity. And I wanted to invite you to say a little bit about how AI can be used or misused by governments. How might AI be used productively to try and address some of the concerns of the humanitarian community? How can it be misused by governments to defeat some of the concerns of the humanitarian community?
So back at the, before I was at Yale, I was at the institution where we dare not say its name, Harvard. And and we worked to build a feature extraction algorithm, and it's not the feature extraction algorithm itself that I want to talk about, but it was the process of trying to deploy it in an operational setting. In this case, in support of Department of Peacekeeping operations, where we learned a lot about sort of the macro issues of deploying AI in humanitarian settings, where it's keep it simple, stupid. We were trying to detect through satellite imagery whether villages had been attacked in Africa based on destruction of a housing type called a tukul. And our biggest problem was teaching the machine to not think that the conical shape of the hut and a boulder and a tree were the same thing. And so it was really driving down false positives. What we realized is that AI helped us speed our decision loops within a peacekeeping setting when we weren't looking for X marks the spot, or we weren't looking for the right answer. We were looking for a decision prompt to reduce the amount of data that we were digesting in highly fragile, highly resource constrained environments. So it wasn't giving us the answer, it was reducing the drag time on getting to answer. So the good news is that increasingly, and I was just on a call in the parking lot coming in here with UN colleagues, where we are using AI productively is on, and we say predictive analytics, but it's decision support to narrow the amount of data a human has to process. That's great. And that does have real implications, positive implications, particularly on cash voucher assistance in delivery, which is becoming more and more the majority of assistance. But the bad news where AI can be devastating is where we use it to make decisions that we shouldn't be using it to make. And I'm not saying anything revolutionary here. In conflict settings where we want AI to basically prioritize populations where we don't have baseline data. That's the big thing. We're using AI often in conflict settings where we don't have the necessary training data to do it responsibly, and we don't have a minimum technical standard to vet those systems. Over.
Great. That's really illuminating, and a whole host of really challenging and interesting questions relating to humanitarian aid and conflict situations that this sort of opens up. I want to turn next to Anat. So we've already talked a bit about the different conception of data privacy that we see in Europe, and the GDPR has already been mentioned in the morning session. But there's also a different position of the EU on questions relating to AI. The EU has proposed its own new proposed draft regulations for AI, which require users to exercise fairness and transparency when utilizing automated decision-making, as well as human oversight of high-risk AI systems, such as facial recognition, which is becoming more and more of a presence in our everyday lives. So for students and others who might not be as familiar with those differences, can you say just a little bit about how Europe is approaching these issues? What are the key differences between European approaches to questions of AI and at the moment, US approaches to these kinds of issues?
So the EU has published a draft in April 2021. It's already been a year, a very long draft trying to create some sort of harmonized framework for legislation of artificial intelligence, which is very different from what the US approach. At the moment, the US approach is fairly fragmented. We have agency by agencies decisions making. We have the FTC and the FDA and the White House making declarations that we want to align ourselves with the EU and that we're creating specific goals and objectives, but nothing at the grander level. We have state laws regarding autonomous vehicles, for example, or some sort of use of facial recognition. California is trying to ban it, for example, but nothing at the federal level. And that is what the EU is trying to push for and doing so in this draft, which is only a draft at the moment. So it creates interesting discussion, but it's not enforceable in any way right now. So beside from the structural differences between the approaches of the US and the EU, we have the core difference that I think the objects that are mentioned in this act is creating trustworthy AI, fairness, transparency. It's not that I don't think the US doesn't want those things. I do believe that it does, and it says that. And so recently, the current administration is trying to align itself with the EU, but it's doing it far more slowly. And I think it's mainly for two reasons. First of all, is the fact that the US considers itself to be in a race with other countries. I don't think the EU sees it the same way. And creating regulations obviously creates some sort of constraints, ethical constraints, legal constraints, which will slow down the process. In that sense, the US, I think, is trying to create some sort of a lenient framework for AI innovation to thrive. The fear of stifling innovation is very big in this context. And I think the EU is less concerned about that. And we can see it with other legislation that the EU has been doing, specifically the GDPR and also data security directives and acts that the EU has been publishing recently. And lastly is something that I already mentioned a little bit is the stifling innovation concern that we can promptly see with the US companies. The mantra of moving fast and breaking things in the process is very American. It brought us Amazon, Google, Facebook, and other companies that are successful, but that have their issues. The EU is not having that at all. And they are trying to create some sort of legal barriers to that very fast movement, which usually has casualties because when you move fast, you do break things in the process. So I think the EU is trying to create some sort of a very interesting framework based on the criticalness and the high risk level of a specific AI. It also goes back to the point of what is AI. They are trying to create some sort of definition. There is also a problem with that, obviously, and creating 4 different categories of high risk, low risk. Also, facial recognition and biometric with AI is kind of a given, but other infrastructures, it's not necessarily obvious which level of riskness or uncertainty it falls into. Another interesting point to make is that out of the 100 startups of AI, only 6 of them are currently located in the EU. So on the one hand, you can say they don't have a lot to lose if they create very strong constraints on the innovation of AI. On the other hand, one of the objects of this EU Act is to actually encourage innovation by creating certainty in the legal framework. So we'll see if that actually can happen. But I don't think the US at the moment has a strong interest to regulate AI in the commercial framework, just because it wants to win the race and make sure that AI, assuming that we consider AI as something that will create aggregate social good to all of us, which I think we are at the moment, we do want to see more AI products on the market. Hopefully autonomous vehicles will be the first one soon.
Can I ask you I want to follow up on the point that you suggested. I don't know if you can give us more granularity into this question of how they're defining AI, because that was a subject of our last session, there was some exchange about the question of what do we mean by artificial intelligence? What exactly is intelligence? It would be illuminating to hear a little bit about what that conversation sounds like in Europe.
Sure. So there is a part trying to define what is AI. It is, I think it's very vague in a lot of aspects. There is also a US definition that the Trump administration published a while back. They're trying to focus on the automation of the process, like machines or algorithms that are based in a way that can create a decision-making process with no human involvement, which means a lot and at the same time means nothing. So it's a very problematic. I think the US and the EU are kind of at the same scenario in this sense. I think what the EU is trying to do with this act that the US is not attempting at the moment is to create the risk levels, which will enable them to create some sort of regulatory framework which is justifiable. So if we have high risk and we create a human oversight board, which the EU specifies it has to be a human sitting in the board itself, making sure there are no human rights violations, and then there is more sense of creating more robust legislation and interfering more with the innovative progress. I think that's what they're trying to create some sort of emphasis on. And also when I write and when colleagues of mine write about AI, we try to avoid that question because it's at the moment, it's really, really hard technically wise to say what specific AI is, because we're talking about singularity or other things that it might happen in the future and might not. So I think this is a very big problem when we try to create meaningful regulation.
So I want to ask you a bit about your own research at the Information Society Project. So you're examining the use of insurance law as a regulatory mechanism that can alleviate risks associated with emerging technology of AI while providing a layer of security to AI companies and users alike. Can you tell us a little bit about this development? And just again, for students who might not think insurance immediately when they're thinking AI, turns out that insurance is actually really interesting part of the conversation in AI and in cyber as well. So one of the big issues that's come up in the broader cyber context is like, what kinds of things are actually insured? And so after the NotPetya attack, for instance, the insurance companies, Zurich in particular, didn't pay out or refused to pay out on some of the insurance contracts, claiming that it was not covered under the existing insurance, even though there was a cybersecurity coverage element, but they said that it was an act of war and therefore wasn't covered by insurance. So insurance has been like a kind of underappreciated driver in this broader space. So and Anat's research is really focusing on the role of insurance in AI and the way in which it can serve this kind of regulatory purpose. So I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that, because I think it's something students might not necessarily expect, but is actually like a really important part of the conversation that we don't always talk about.
I want to amplify that because I feel like when I say insurance, I lose half of the room. Insurance is, I mean, we have it everywhere in our lives. I think it's a very important tool. No one will drive a car without having insurance. I think most of us will not travel abroad without knowing, especially during pandemic times, that we have some sort of health coverage. Cyber insurance market is the biggest growing market in insurance products recently, given the demand, obviously. So I view insurance as a very important regulatory mechanism, or just a hedging risk mechanism that AI companies and emerging technologies in general can use. We can see that from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We had fire policies and flood policies, and that were not necessary until we created the steam engine and the aviation process and the automobile process. Everything, insurance was backing up innovation and backing up companies in order to make sure that, again, assuming that we are looking at a technology that has a net positive aggregate in the aggregation for all of us, we do want to make sure that consumers and governments are able to use these types of technologies. And insurance provides in their policies a mechanism of risk shifting and risk transferring from the companies themselves, the Googles of the world, actually more like startups. I don't think Google necessarily needs insurance, because most of the time they will have the money to cover from themselves. But startup companies that we want to encourage to innovate and create some sort of new competition in this market, insurance can offer policies and make sure that there is some sort of hedging mechanism to push competition and to push the creation of new technologies. We can see it in the context of AI. A lot of discussion has been made about autonomous vehicles in this sense. We know right now that we are driving a car, we need to have a policy. There is a big discussion about who should purchase the policy when we have AVs, because there is no driver. So technically the driver cannot do anything in order to be safer. We know we have a policy. We know that if we screw up on the road, we will have, there's a certain limitation and caps we will have to pay. And also we don't want to get hurt, obviously. But when we talk about autonomous vehicles, we cannot incentivize the driver in the same way. A lot of scholars have discussed maybe manufacturers themselves will purchase the policy. And Tesla, for example, wants to offer policies for their consumers, just to show how confident they are in their product. Because let's be honest, not a lot of us will go on an autonomous vehicle right now. We don't feel safe. So they're trying to push that in this direction. Other example can be malpractice suits of doctors and lawyers when we have an AI algorithm assisting them. It's already happening. Again, we assume that this kind of cooperation and usage is creating social good, and we want to push for it. So insurance companies has the tools to incentivize us to be safer and providing hedging risk mechanism by just shifting the burden of the risk to them via a premium, obviously, that we will have to pay. So insurance is, I think it's a very interesting topic. And as you said, cyber insurance is a very big thing right now. And I expect it to continue to grow, especially when we see a lot of AI coming into the market. We as consumers might want to even buy some sort of policy to make sure that we are hedged, even if we're not mandated to do that. So I see great things in the future for the intersection of this.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So Wendell, I want to turn to you. You've been thinking about these issues for a lot longer than any of the rest of us. You are way ahead of the game in realizing that AI ethics and governance issues were going to become pressing, and you've been writing about this and teaching and thinking about this for decades. So you're far ahead of us. You have written that you think we're failing nonetheless at both AI ethics and governance. And I wanted to invite you to say a bit about what you mean by that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for that question. I think our failures are legion.
Oh, I think your microphone may have been pulled out. I want to make sure everybody can hear everything you have to say.
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Ted. I think our failures actually are legion. And that's not for lack of trying. 15 years ago, there may have been 100, 200 of us in the world who cared about these issues. There are thousands. Yale Law School alone is churning out God knows how many. And that's happening at many other law schools in the country. And that's just the law school, what the law schools are doing. Their social science approaches. Excuse me. The IEEE, which is one of the leading bodies for setting standards for engineers, has a major project to put in place P2000, P7000 standards and soft law for the governance of autonomous systems. And they claim to have 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people involved in those alone. So it's not that we don't have people involved, it's just the breadth of the challenge, the daunting considerations in the challenges, and perhaps most importantly, the conflicts on the policy level. So what do I mean by the conflicts on the policy level? Well, AI, the internet, particularly in the United States, but even worldwide, cyber warfare, they're all largely ungoverned spaces. And this burgeoning of interest in AI ethics has not changed that per se. And even though in the ivory tower and in legal circles and so forth, we are considering these issues and we're generating proposals, the big questions are being avoided on the national level. And we really don't have any effective mechanisms in place for international cooperation around those issues that require that. And furthermore, it's getting worse on the international level. Maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. But we are exacerbating the prospects for international cooperation and increasing the prospects for not only a decoupling of the Chinese and US economies, but perhaps a decoupling even with the European economy, challenges for countries like Japan and Australia about who they are going to be most aligned with. So that's the number one issue. The number one issue is this inability to set in place to make the hard policy decisions that allow us to know where to move forward. And in lieu of those decisions, the tech companies and the tech billionaires have inordinate freedoms to dictate for all of us what our future will look like. And so that becomes the problem of, well, who's really making decisions about enhancement technologies, about the metaverse, and whose interests are getting served by the way those decisions are being made. So a lot of energy is going into operationalizing these ethics principles. There was an explosion of ethics principles about 3 years ago. There's generally consensus around most of those. So there's a couple, there's a couple of areas of differences. But operationalizing those principles is unbelievably difficult, number one. And number two, most of the ethical challenges we are posing don't have some binary logic that can be answered by applying one principle and another. We all are hopeful that ethics will give us that algorithm, but it doesn't. And particularly when you're talking about emerging technologies, you're talking about complex adaptive systems that are being embedded in complex socio-technological environments. So what does that mean? That means they're going to act unpredictably at times. And that means they're going to give rise to gray swans, meaning risks that we can sort of recognize, and they're going to give rise on occasion to black swan events, high impact, low probability events that have far reaching consequences. So in addition to the problem of operationalizing and making the hard policy decisions, we have to re-envision what the role of ethics is in the digital age. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's get off of the shtick that ethics is going to give you some simple device for deciding what is good and bad, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. I consider the languages of ethics to largely be tools for underscoring considerations we want factored into difficult decisions, to look at the trade-offs between various courses of action, and not just to come up with some maximizing principles, some utilitarian principles to choose among those different pathways, but also in making the difficult choices. A good ethical decision is one that's going to address the risks and societal consequences that then were entailed in the pathway that we chose and address those. Find ways of being accountable to those. So we're talking about making hard choices. We're talking about grounding our decisions in accountability and responsibility, and if necessary, liability and culpability. That's really not happening.
So I wanted to turn next, that's a lot of provocative points there, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up on that more. But I wanted to turn next to, you kind of alluded to this kind of question of international cooperation. And so we've got this question of ethics and governance at both at the domestic level and at the international level. And I want to invite you to say a little bit about how you see the differences between the US, EU, and China approaches to AI. So for example, China's articulated a multilateral conception of internet governance, which is sometimes seen as being at some odds with the multi-stakeholder approach advocated by the United States and European nations, which is generally referred, when people say multi-stakeholder, what they often mean is sort of incorporates private actors, private sector, privacy, civil society perspectives. Whereas China has been seen as, and you can tell me if you see this differently, really working towards a world in which states are much more responsible for regulating their own citizens' internet usage according to national law. And that has significant implications for civil rights and liberties and access to information. So how do you see this debate playing out with regard to artificial intelligence, and whose interests are being served by the different narratives around this conflict at the international level?
Great. Another massive question that I
Yes.
can only address in a superficial way. So let me break it down into three elements. The first point I want to make is around the difference between the key approaches, which are the US, China, and the EU, but there is India in there. There's little Singapore, who has actually a pretty robust approach in place. So let me first talk about that. Then I'm going to try and talk about China. How does one talk about China in an American audience? Very carefully. And you will forgive me if in my attempt to talk about China in perhaps a more open way than we often do, I stumble, because it isn't easy and I'm still exploring how to have that conversation. Then third, I will talk about this question of multi-stakeholderism and what's at stake in multi-stakeholderism, and its alliance with also international human rights law. So again, a pretty large platter. So let me see if I can say a few key points to give you all at least a sense of what the lay of the land is. So you've heard Anat talk about the EU. So the only thing I want to add to the discussion of the EU is the EU is really making a good faith attempt to address the ethical challenges and risks and establish some degree of accountability for the major providers of AI services. And they are consciously willing to sacrifice some of the innovation benefits of AI if that's what it takes. But Anat has already mentioned a couple of the problems they're encountering. Let me mention a couple more. GDPR, which has actually been one of the great successes in AI governance, which came initially out of the EU and it's sort of been standardized worldwide. It also has calls for transparency, explainability, all kinds of things that are very difficult, maybe impossible to achieve. The tech industry will fight those requirements with tooth and claw because it threatens some of the existence of major corporations. And within the EU, there's a debate about how far they want to go in terms of holding tech companies accountable, particularly if it does threaten innovation. And the second part I alluded to in my earlier comments was a conversation going on in the EU right now is if we establish these standards, what does that mean in terms of our willingness to be open to standards technologies which have been developed, for example, in China or India or the United States under very different standards? So that becomes the question of the EU decoupling. So that's the EU. Now let's talk about China. China is an authoritarian country. That's a given. The one thing the Chinese Communist Party is clear about is the maintenance of its power, of its authority. I don't know if it cares whether we have multi-stakeholderism within our countries. It just cares that liberal determinations of what human rights are do not dictate to the Chinese government what actions they can and cannot take. So when we look at China, we always look at it first and foremost through the eyes of, well, all of this is just reinforcing state power, isn't it? And I think that's the problem we're having because we aren't fully understanding China. We're not taking the time to understand what's going on in China. So look at the Chinese approach to AI governance. They actually have enacted much more rigorous constraints on tech firms operating in China. Strangely enough, the kinds of constraints that leaders within the EU, that many of us within America would like to see put on tech cultures, they've enacted those constraints. They've got ahead of the game on that. Now we look at it cynically often and we say, well, that's just a consolidation of state power, isn't it? Because the Chinese aren't doing anything to constrain the state's use of AI technology. They're looking largely at the corporation. But I think that's perhaps a little too cynical, because a few things are going on in China that we don't fully understand. The Chinese government, like the Russian government, just to bring us onto the news page today, they are terrified that the public will turn on them. And they know they're in a quasi-democratic capitalist era where they can't just engage in the old style repressions. Therefore, they try to be sensitive to the concerns of the Chinese people, as long as those concerns don't threaten the power of the party. So that's perhaps a good way of talking about China. Some of my Chinese colleagues have argued with me that their government is more democratic than ours in its sensitivity to, well, obviously, if you're a Uyghur or you're a democratic protester coming out of Hong Kong, you don't think that's the case at all. But the simple fact, which is very difficult for us, is that China has the Chinese government has a very high degree of trust from its people, whereby the US government is at an all-time low in terms of our trust of government. And again, which government we trust has a lot to do with who's in power. And well, you all know that story, so I don't have to go down that road at all. But let me give you just one little example of what is taking place there. In China, over the last 40 years, 700 to 800 million people have been pulled out of poverty. So that's a lot to do with the trust of the Chinese people. That's twice the population in the United States. During that same 40-year period, real wages have declined in both the US and in Europe. Not only that, in that same 40-year period, the top 1% of Americans have acquired $21 trillion in wealth. And during the same period, the bottom 50% of citizens in the United States have lost roughly $900 billion in net worth. So, tells you a little bit about what's going on in the trust bandwagon. Now let's talk very quickly about the United States. What's happening in the United States in terms of AI governance? Not a whole hell of a lot. Even though there is a general consensus with both Republicans and Democrats about problematics with social media. But that doesn't mean we've enacted any serious policy to constrain social media and make it responsible or culpable for its action. Furthermore, within the United States, we have what I will call a cult of innovation. And the cult of innovation basically means if you enact constraints on technologies, you will interfere with efficiency and productivity gains. And that argument tends to win the day, or at least divide the American Congress enough that it becomes very difficult to enact anything. Now let me quickly move to multi-stakeholder governance, which is something I've been championing for years now, and put forward some of the proposals that are being looked at. But when we say multi-stakeholderism, what are we talking about? And which stakeholders are we talking about? Some people think multi-stakeholderism just means that they get a voice in policy formation, or that the tech companies have a voice in policy formation, which basically means stockholders have a voice in policy formation, or that the AI researchers have a voice in policy formation. What about consumers? What about workers? What about the disabled? What about marginalized communities? What about the global South? What if technological unemployment devastates countries in Africa? Do they have any input into whether those policies are put into place? And if so, how? And if you start to look at that, you realize there's almost been no thought on how that might occur. There have been proposals, and I'm happy to say that Gary Marchant and I have championed some of those proposals. Interestingly enough, our proposals for the governance of AI and emerging technologies were born here at Yale in Morey's, when Gary, who is the director of the Center for Law and Innovation at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law, just a side note, more is going on the ethics and governance of emerging technologies at Arizona State University than perhaps most of the other universities in the United States, that we sat there lamenting the bad state of the governance of emerging technologies. And at one point we turned the conversation 180 degrees and we said, if we had our druthers, what would we put in place? And we came up with a proposal that we called governance coordinating committees that has morphed into global governance coordinating committees for AI and global governance networks for AI. Concrete ways of thinking about creative approaches to AI governance that focus on multi-stakeholderism and how you might actually be able to put meaning multi-stakeholderism in place, and on soft law governance. So what is soft law governance for those of you who don't know what that is? That's standards, laboratory practices and procedures, insurance policies. It's a whole plethora of instruments we have to shape the development of technologies. The advantages of them are they can be formulated very quickly and they can also be jettisoned when they're no longer applicable. The disadvantages that they seldom come with means of enforcement, but often they are the precursors to what is formulated as hard law. So let me stop there because again, I could go on a little too long here.
No, it's great. And I think that this conversation has highlighted some challenges. And I think there's some coherence across various speakers here on this question of what are the impediments to governance? What are the different approaches to governance in the US and EU and now China in particular, that in the US, governance of AI has been seen as incompatible with innovation, and that has had some role in sort of impeding movement towards more serious thinking about governance. And I think this last point that you raise of once we get to the point of actually thinking about governance, who gets to decide and who's involved in that conversation and whose interests are being taken into account. I think those are really important issues, again, for students to be thinking about, because we're entering a world in which probably we're going to have to start thinking seriously about governance and whose interests are going to be at the table. How do we think about bringing everyone to the table, not just have this be kind of led by a small group of tech experts, but have a kind of broader conversation. And that brings me to my last question. And again, start thinking of your questions, the audience. We're hopefully going to have a little bit more time. So Wendell, I'm going to ask you to keep this on the short side, even though, again, I know we could easily go on about this for a while, but you have a post today where you criticize what you call the techno-military industrial academic complex. And I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about this. I mean, I think we get some sense of your concerns from what you've said thus far, but what do you mean by that? And in particular, what role do you think academia can play positively? So we can be concerned about the sort of negative role that academia can play, but how can we contribute in a positive way to emergence of governance in the AI space?
Okay, so that was actually set off by a grant that TED acquired. It was not a criticism of TED, but it does refer to that. The post is on the Fortune website and went up this morning. Let me at least indulge a little bit of ancient history for you, because as the post does, the military-industrial complex was a term coined by President Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address. And he was basically warning Americans against the growing power. Now, this is coming from a general who basically led the Allied efforts to win the Second World War, and he's cautioning citizens about that. Fast forward a few years to the Vietnam War and uprisings from our 60s generation, I'm that old, on campuses that culminated in more than 900 schools going out, striking when the US expanded its war into Cambodia. I'm not going to belabor that at all, but one of the key elements was the concern that the universities had been complicit in the Vietnam War, that they were complicit, that our role in the university was largely about channeling power, discerning which of us have the correct skills and values to move into elite positions, particularly at universities like Harvard and Yale. I was at Harvard at that point. The extent to which we were actually not getting a full, what I say, liberal education. We were getting an education that was promulgating certain values that were racist, sexist, elitist, insensitive to the environment, and had bequeathed us an unnecessary war in Vietnam that was asking young men to sacrifice their lives for their country, right or wrong was the phrase. So that's what the uprising been. It led to a lot of reforms going on in educational context. But more recently, the concern has been the availability of tech money from tech billionaires, the role that tech money is playing in not only buying lawmakers, but perhaps also capturing what is going on educational contexts, and whether educational contexts are fulfilling their liberal obligations, their expressed obligations to engage in deep inquiry and considerations of what's taking place. So what precipitated this column for me was that I had already been formulating a critique of a narrative that Eric Schmidt had been putting forward and proselytizing through a number of vehicles, including a book he recently wrote with Henry Kissinger, but also through leading a national commission on defense strategy, on AI and defense strategy. And that in many ways, his narrative from the perspective of some of us is quite self-serving. And it's only one of many competing narratives, but it gets to buy a certain degree of influence in the marketplace. And I was concerned that in naming the institution, AI, emerging technologies, and national power, not international cooperation or international security, even national security, the institution had bought into Eric Schmidts. And that's this broader concern about what's going on with academia today. Understand that academic institutions in the last 40, 50 years have become so dependent upon research and often look at research more than education as what distinguishes them. And to do research, you need money. I don't begrudge Ted getting money from Eric Schmidt, but Yale is way behind in taking up these issues of the influence of AI and emerging technologies, and tragically behind because there are faculty members and others of us on campus who've actually been leading some of these efforts. And there has been in the underground some serious activism around these concerns, but Yale has been far behind for two reasons. One, it's not a priority, and second, there hasn't been money. And for me, the tragedy was that the money was coming from somebody who is pushing a particular narrative. And what I think the responsibility of all of us is to look very deeply at these tech narratives, the hype, the inevitability of artificial general intelligence, or the transhumanist narrative that we are going to invent our evolutionary and our evolutionary successors, and we may even be inventing the human species as we know it out of existence. It's very important that we unpack these narratives, are suspicious of words like inevitable. Oh, and let me mention one other point. And China and our relationship to China has become central to many of these narratives. And therefore, I want us to look much more deeply at what we're doing with China. Now, I'm an advocate for multi-stakeholderism and international humanitarian rights law, and I say so when I'm in China. And I point out to the Chinese that they were signers of the International Declaration of Human Rights. So it's not like we're not having these conversations there. But the point I'm trying to make is we're in a very delicate time right now. There's a ratcheting up of hostilities. Every move that China makes, the US makes a counter move, and you can almost feel people looking over their shoulders at what each other is doing. And the simple point here is, do we really want to go down this road of weaponizing AI, of lethal autonomous weapon systems, of hyper cyber warfare? Or are we going to move towards some forms of international cooperation, even if sometimes that means sacrificing the realization of our values in China?
Great.
So
Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Ted to manage the questions. I don't know if you want to take a few at once, but I'm going to leave it to you to manage how you want to handle that.
Sure. I know this is a great conversation, and well, Wendell, you know that based on our own conversations, I mean, I think we're really interested in bridging the divide and really engaging people across the campus who are focused on AI from different vantage points. And it's not just law, technology, and policy. It's the ethics, and you've been just a global leader in this, and you can really be our conscience on these issues. And it's something that we're really closely attuned to and look forward to collaborating on. So let's get some questions from the audience. Yes, please, and just make sure green mic and state your name. Thanks so much.
Sure, thank you. My name is Caroline Lefevre. I'm a first-year law student. And my question is about, I guess, the threat to American consumers and their privacy and well-being. I think our previous panel kind of focused on the private or domestic threat, right? And Professor Hathaway's article outlined a father who found out his daughter was pregnant because Target was sending her pregnancy coupons. But here during this panel, we're kind of hearing about state-sponsored threats. So as you know, a law student and to policymakers, where do you think we should be concentrating our efforts since the threat is so ubiquitous? Should we be focusing on private domestic companies, or should we be focusing on the national security element? And do these two buckets have similar solutions? Is the solution regulation of or regulation against? So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
You want to take that? Go ahead, Nathaniel. Yeah. Did you address that? Who did you want?
Good, Nathaniel, you want to go ahead and jump in?
Go ahead.
I think the most powerful tool and the least used tool is tort law. And so what we have in common across this panel is that we're talking about something that I call absorptive capacity. And in the early aughts with Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, the focus was on disruption. And we looked at technology through this fetishization of disruptive effect. But now in the hangover period, we are talking about how do we build absorptive capacity for societies to integrate newness into normal in a way that negotiates its impact on values, on vulnerability, on equity. And the most powerful tool we have in terms of building absorptive capacity and absorptive precedence is tort law. Now, part of the problem here, which my colleagues know better than I do, is how do you sue an algorithm? And that's a large part of what we're figuring out. And so I would point to, and I'm looking at Ellen here, who is a TF in my data governance class. She's gonna hear this for the 28th time. Read Obermeyer's article 2019 in Science on Impact Pro in United Healthcare and the calibration bias and the potential negligence and liability on calibration bias as it relates to populations of color in the United States in healthcare algorithms. I think Obermeyer's work on that is if you want to look at the future, read that article. And it's really at the heart of it is the question of how do we think about assigning responsibility and decision that has the pathway to causal harm is opaque to unknown even to the system. And so I'll defer to my colleagues here. But the last thing I want to say, if you want to see where the future is going, look where Wendell Wallach has been.
I'll just add really quickly to that. I agree with that. I mean, I think what's so exciting about this area is, in answer to your question, like where do we focus our attention, domestic, international? The answer is all of the above. I will say that at the international, which is an area that I focus on as an international lawyer, progress has been very slow, and getting cooperation at the global level has been kind of creeping along at a particularly not a pace that's keeping up with the technology. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Some of the dynamics that we've discussed about why there's impediments to domestic regulation are also impeding international regulation, to the extent that the states that traditionally have led the way on international law are also the ones who are kind of the forefront of these technologies and therefore don't have a whole lot of interest in regulating them. It means that you kind of have slower movement in terms of international regulation than you might otherwise hope for. So that's a reason to think about domestic, making progress at the domestic level. And there's always going to be a conversation between the two, as you see from GDPR, which is a European initiative, but it's had a global impact because the ways in which they've regulated data privacy in Europe, any business that does business in Europe basically has adopted those policies worldwide. And so in a way, there's ways in which actually regulating at the national level can have international implications. And I think we're going to see this kind of constant conversation back and forth between the two. So I think finding your space, if it's tort law, if it's international law, if it's insurance law, I mean, there's so much. Part of what I find so thrilling and exciting about this area is there's like just a million different ways in which we need to make progress. And so as a young person entering the field, it's kind of like, the world's your oyster. There's a million different things that you could potentially be working on.
On the question of tort law and not being able to sue an algorithm, I just want to give Anat a moment to comment. We do have a question here virtually from one of our fellows about the metaverse and the extent to which maybe you've thought or should be thinking a little bit about governance and regulatory considerations in that context. What are the policy issues that might come to your mind as you think about a virtual world with physical characteristics or the ability to have physical harm?
So I think this is a fascinating question. I don't really think there's an answer as of now. Tort law is the answer, I believe, in a lot of aspects, and I do write about it and talk about it. There is a big issue with privacy because I don't think, which is kind of controversial, I don't think privacy is really a thing in the US compared to the EU, or just in general how people understand the scope of the right itself and how much protection we should give to it. A recent example is the Meta Facebook and Instagram, the new rebranded Meta, who just 2 days ago said that they will withdraw from Europe because of really strict regulations that prevent them from processing Europeans' information on US-based data sets. And the EU response was just, okay, you can do that. They simply did not care. It was hilarious. So this very big gap between the EU and the US when we talk about privacy, it connects to history, of course, and the concept of dignity and what amounts to the violation of dignity. You can see it also with speech in the US versus EU, which is a whole new, different conversation. But this gap is really a big thing when we talk about international regulation. And the metaverse creates a whole new challenge, but also something that we already know, because most of the business that these companies conduct have some sort of international effects, and they transcend national borders, and international law has a big part in that. And also I think tort law will have a big part in that. There is already been suits about lawsuits about emotional harms that have been caused in the meta universe, and also physical, which is easier to do. It's in its infancy, this kind of conversation. I think the meta universe presents a lot of interesting topics to research, given its novelty and the fact that there's a lot of harms that are being created, and torts and insurance and privacy are just free aspects of it that one can delve into. Given that we are a common law system, it will take time until the court system will actually start to discuss this. But I do think that in the US, for example, privacy harms will be less considered something that you can compensate for vis-a-vis what happens in the EU, and the GDPR is a very good example for it. And unfortunately, time will only tell. Right now, it's really early to say, but I do think there is a cause of action in the tort system. I just think it will be less considered in the US, given the history and the current statutory framework of privacy regulation.
Let's get 2 questions from the audience, and then I'll figure out how to apportion them amongst our panelists. Yeah, please. Introduce.
Sure. I'm Andrew Doris. I'm a second-year grad student at the Jackson Institute. Several of you mentioned that the United States is wanting to move fast on AI development, in part from a sense that it's in a race with rival countries. But there's other sorts of global risks like climate change or maybe pandemic defense, where the US and China are mostly able to recognize that it threatens both of their security, and so kind of reframe it as an opportunity for cooperation. Maybe this is an overbroad question, but what would it take to shift the thinking of great powers about AI in the same way? Is it just at the mercy of broader geopolitical tensions, or is there some way to actually scare policy leaders about the downsides of getting this wrong, even more than they're scared of China, for example?
I'll give that one to you, Wendell, in a minute on China, but let's get another question. Yes.
I also had a question for Mr. Wallach. I was wondering about your thoughts on the future of AI research funding, specifically as it relates to national defense. Last semester in Professor Winstein's class, we read the National Security Commission Artificial Intelligence report, which is basically saying we're falling behind China, or maybe we're not yet, but we will be. Although I do recognize that's also chaired by Eric Schmidt. So maybe there's.
So I'm getting sort of hit with both of those. That's great.
Well, they're both related to China, of course, for sure. And the possibility, I think, of cooperation or an arms race and inevitable conflict.
Let's be clear, we're at an inflection point in human history. And decisions are probably going to be made over the next 10 to 20 years that are going to determine whether you're going to live in a viable world or not, whether you're going to live in a sustainable world and be able to bequeath a meaningful world to your children. And that's what's at stake here. The 2 clearly most destabilizing factors at the moment are climate change and the destabilizing impacts of emerging technologies. Those are the 2 big issues that we're dealing with. The latter becomes particularly complicated because all these same technologies are often solutions, but not always solutions. Techno-solutionism is a bit insane to many of our most serious problems. And both of those require international cooperation in an array of different areas. If we ratchet up a Cold War with China, forget about international cooperation. It's not that China does not also recognize the problems of climate change. It's just that they're going to be pretty slow, and we're going to be pretty slow to reach agreements with each other. And in the meantime, climate change continues, and we lose the opportunity to take the necessary steps to at least slow it down. We aren't going to stop it, but at least to slow it down and to solve some of the destabilizing effects of that. Can you imagine if we have 1 billion people by 2050 who are affected by extreme climate events, what that's going to mean in terms of refugee crises? We can't even handle the refugee crises today without destabilizing democratic countries around the world and empowering authoritarian leaders. So we all know that. And emerging technologies have the same thing, the weaponization of AI, so again, we've said this, cyber warfare, we can go on and on about what the AI issues are. So there's a very delicate balance, and always has been, between when you take a defensive posture to a competitor who might be aggressive in some areas, and when you move for international cooperation. It's a very delicate balance. I'm clearly on the side of our leaning much more heavily on the international cooperation, even if that sometimes means, and God forbid that I'm saying this because I wouldn't have said it when I was your age, that we have to compromise some of our values, or at least give them latitude in what they do to their citizens, however egregious we may or may not consider that to be. So remind me quickly, just in 2 words, what the second question was.
About the future of AI funding, specifically as it relates from the government towards sort of AI weaponry.
So it's all, I mean, so the push right now is to create an alliance between the government and the AI industry, as if it's not rich enough. But we want much more government funding, and we want much more government funding because if we don't put much more government funding in, we will lose competition with China. Yes, perhaps, but a lot of other forces are in motion in this world that don't make that the inevitable conclusion of what's going on right now. China will also be dealing with some, but the narrative out there is we're damned if we don't, and we have to be able to negotiate from a position of power. Perhaps, but what kind of power do we need and we don't need? And who stands to benefit if that particular narrative is the one we buy into? So that's all I'm saying right now. Let's inspect that narrative, because that narrative feeds into a lot of other things that are quite discomforting. It's not only the militarization of AI. Part and parcel of that narrative is that AI is smarter, going to be smarter than humans in decision making, and we have to learn how to defer to their judgments, because we won't be able to understand how they're making the decisions they're making. To my mind, that's the height of immorality. And like Joan, I'm also deeply skeptical. I consider myself, I often have called myself the friendly skeptic when it comes to a lot of the hype around emerging technologies. Friendly to the can-do engineering spirit, skeptical that, for example, we know enough about intelligence to even know what can be realized technologically and what can't.
So I'm afraid we are out of time, but let me just say thank you so much to our panelists. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope that our listeners online, and I expect our students, will be joining us for the next conversation, which is on March 4th, where we'll talk about disinformation and the future of democracy. So we'll dig into, I think, some of these questions in a deeper way. We'll be talking about deep fakes and coordinated inauthentic behavior, and about using the social sciences to counter disinformation and online extremism. I think we might also dig a little bit more into some of these questions about the tension between governance and cooperation and human rights. You know, so these, I think, are going to be issues we're going to be facing. And then our third session will be on April 1st, and we'll return to questions of AI ethics and safety. We'll be talking about technical safety, research and trust in AI, and developing AI ethics and norms. So we'll be returning to many of the themes that we have begun the conversation about today. So thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. It's been a great start to the series, and we look forward to continuing this conversation over the next couple of months. So thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Please do grab some food upstairs, and appreciate you coming out on a rainy Friday morning. Great.
Bye.